As Lakshmi said, I'm Uli Köppen. I'm part of German public broadcasting. I'm very happy to be here today because we really want to discuss our guidelines with you. And let's jump right into it, I would say. I have the pleasure to work with 3 teams at German public broadcasting. The oldest one is our data team, BR Data, here in the middle, that grew together with our investigative team. And on top of that, we had the chance to build another team. It's called AI and Automation Lab. And we did that 2 years ago. So this is the youngest one. What we have in common is we're using algorithms and automation for journalism, and we are having 2 missions. The first one is investigative journalism, and the second one is product, automated formats. Let's first have a look for the investigative part. A few years ago, we started to specialize in algorithmic accountability reporting, which means that we are reporting on algorithms with algorithmic methods. We are interdisciplinary teams with coders and journalists working side by side. And this is a story where we also used AI as a tool. It's called Hate Machine Facebook. And it's about how Facebook has hate speech on its platform and how it stayed there in part for a very long time. And to tell the story, we had to sift through a lot of content, through a lot of not tagged content. And the pictures, as you know, perhaps are a problem to find without any tags. That's why we trained an object recognition algorithm. And we could find things like swastikas or Hitler pictures, so we could tell this story. But we did not only train this algorithm, we trained a very specific algorithm. It was published by Facebook Research. And then with that, we had this little ironical twist in the story that we could not only tell the story about how hate speech is on Facebook, but also that Facebook already has the tools on hand to really detect this kind of content. So this is the kind of reporting we are doing. And this is an example for a story where we used AI. Now let's have a look to the other part of our mission, the automated formats part. We are using all kinds of automation for automated texts, automated graphics or tables. And we not only use AI for that, we also use more mundane forms of automation like get texts, for example. These are examples for products where we also use AI. This is a summarization tool where you put in a larger text, and with one click, you get a shorter text out of it. And this should help our journalists to produce different versions of stories. So for that, we also use AI. On the right-hand side, you can see a prototype for a regional automated news briefing. It's audio. And for that, we have to tag a lot of audio material. And we try to do that automatically. For that, we use AI to drag out things like geotags and persons that are mentioned in this audio or topics. And also the segmentation to get small bits and pieces of news is done automatically. And also for that, we use AI. So this is a broad overview where we are using AI as a team, and also in our broadcaster, we are using AI and automation for the whole news cycle, more or less. And this is why we gathered in an interdisciplinary group 1.5 years ago or 2 years ago when we started to write our guidelines. This QR code leads you directly to our guidelines in English, and we published them 1.5 years ago. And I'll just walk you through the process, writing them and then publishing them. At first, we met in this interdisciplinary group to write down our strategy, where we want to use AI and how we want to do that now and in the future. And by writing the strategy, we also looked at the use cases. And by looking at the use cases, we saw a lot of pitfalls that might occur or that have already occurred. And that led us to the idea to write down solutions for that. So in the beginning, it was just a list of solutions for pitfalls we might meet in the future or have already met. This list grew and grew and grew. And when the strategy was done, this list was really remarkable. And in the end, we looked at the list and saw that might be a very helpful tool for our journalists and for our newsrooms when they are confronted with automated workflows. For example, when newsrooms meet the need to integrate automated text into their workflows, they also have to shift what they understand by editorial control. Of course, editorial control still has to be in place, but you have to transfer it from checking every piece of journalism to checking the data, checking the math behind the data, checking the data pipeline, and then having kind of a better workflow where you integrate this algorithmic workflow in your day-to-day workflow as a newsroom. And for this, we thought it might be interesting for newsrooms to have those guidelines at hand. That's why we published them internally first. And then as a second step, we also published them externally because we felt the need to discuss them, because we were very aware that, of course, we are in the beginning of something. We are using technology for a very long time as broadcasters, but this kind of technology might add something new. And that's why we felt the need to discuss those guidelines that were very specific to us. We looked at our use cases. So we wanted to get feedback from journalists, from scientists, and in the end, that really worked out. When we published them, we got a lot of feedback and we had the chance to discuss them. And this is why I'm looking forward to your questions as well, because we really regard them as living standards. We are going to rewrite them, perhaps down the road in a year or so, when we get more input and also when we learn more how we want to use AI and automation and how not, and where pitfalls might occur. Now let's jump into our guidelines. I picked out some of the points. This is really our North Star, the user benefit. Does it support our mission? Because we as public service broadcasters, we are doing journalism for everyone. So when we use new technology, also AI, we have to answer two questions. The first one is, does it make our products more attractive? Or does that make them fit better to our user interests? That's the first question. The second question is, can we use our resources more effectively by using this technology? Because we're financed publicly, and of course, we have to be accountable for using our resources wisely. Then we want to foster a conscious data culture. And by that, we understand that we want to be transparent. We as data journalists had some time to practice that because data journalism is per se very, very transparent. So we are used to publish our data if we can with our stories. We also publish our methods, and we are very used to publish what we can say with this data and those analysis and what we can't say. And we always try to transfer that also to the use of algorithms. So if we work with vendors, for example, those vendors have to make plain how they train their algorithm, for example, what the training data was like and where the flaws of this software might be. Then we want to foster a general data awareness in our broadcaster, meaning that we only want to gather the data we need to really meet our user interests. And I've put data avoidance on the slide. So we try to avoid data as much as we can, and we only try to gather the data we really need to make our product better. And the quality of metadata is something that is very important to explain to our newsrooms, because as you can imagine, metadata is not the sexiest thing in the world. And it is really useful, and it's also our job to explain to our journalists what is in for them if they care for the metadata, if they put in the geodata, for example, where did they gather all this material, or who is mentioned in this piece of audio, for example. And that's the most important part, right? That's the human part. We are trying to build up a skill set within our broadcaster and not only buy that kind of software. This is why we build teams like ours, and this is why we try to disseminate what we know within the broadcaster by getting other people in our teams and also by sharing our methods by a lot of means. Where we still have to get better is the talent pipeline, because it's very, very difficult to integrate people from technology to journalism. That is the first step where we succeeded to build up some pipelines. And now we have to succeed to build up pipelines of talents with diverse backgrounds. This is something where we still have to get better as an industry and also as a team, I would say. What is very crucial to us is that we have an interdisciplinary reflection on the way we use AI. So I mentioned this interdisciplinary group where we wrote the strategy. That is still in place. So we are meeting within this group every 6 weeks or so, and we're discussing our use cases. And having those people from all over the place coming together, from technology, from product, from editorial, that really gives us a place to discuss what we do and the pitfalls, and also to prioritize together. So this non-hierarchical way to talk about AI is something I can really recommend, and what really works out for us. In the end, some key takeaways for you. I would always start with your own use cases, because we are not producing a piece of philosophy in the end. We are trying to produce something that is really useful for newsrooms, useful for our journalists, and starting with your use cases helps you to focus on what you really want to do. We also got inspired by other guidelines. There is a lot of out there. There are other industries who also publish what they wrote down, and this is also very useful for journalism, I would say. Then the typical journalistic process to write down your thoughts and then discuss them within the group in an interdisciplinary group is most helpful, I would say. That's really helpful, because writing that down helps you to understand the process, understand what is still missing. So really having those 10 points, 10 aspects in the end, or 5 or whatever, helps you to focus. And then in the end, it might make sense to rewrite them. This is something we still have to do, and we are planning to do within the next year or so. And now I'm really looking forward to your questions and also to Claire's presentation.
Wonderful. So thank you so much to Journalism AI for hosting, and Uli for I get to go after you, which is a joy because you gave a ton of examples for how AI is being used in your newsroom. And just to kick off, again, my name is Claire Leibowitz, and I'm the head of the AI and Media Integrity Program at the Partnership on AI. We are not a newsroom, and as our name would imply, we are a partnership of almost 100 institutions from academia, media, industry, technology industry, and civil society who come together to create best practices for AI and making sure that AI will have a positive impact on the world, which is a broad mandate. And the program area that I lead is predicated on an also big question, which is how do we have a healthy information ecosystem in the AI age, of which a good media and journalism ecosystem is a key part. And for the past few years, let me actually reload my slides so that hopefully the new slide loads. For the past few years, we've been working on several elements of this kind of information ecosystem question. And what I'll suggest is that there's both attention to specific domains like local news in our work and newsrooms, which I'll get to in the bulk of this presentation, but also actual kind of technologies that have societal impact. So in particular, those are what we describe as content targeting and ranking, which is algorithmic recommendation of content, which may be relevant to newsrooms themselves, as well as synthetic and manipulated content, or deep fakes, or fake images, text, audio, and video. So I think this point might come up later, Lakshmi, in the sense that we can think about principal development for domains, but we can also think about principal development for actual types of technology as well, and which one of these may be more useful. But for the past few years, the way we conduct our work is that we convene a community of partners. And again, that point around interdisciplinarity that Uli brought up is super important and integral to our work. The belief that an AI researcher at some of the largest technology companies should be in the same room as someone with deep editorial expertise from a newsroom, and that should inform AI policy and guidelines. We also research and write and inform the policy ecosystem as well. And a little over a year ago, we got involved in trying to think about how AI and local news and that intersection, which journalism AI has been thinking about for a while, can best serve the public interest. And I'll ground my assessment of the landscape and offer of recommendations in the perspectives of several of our partners who we asked a provocation question earlier this year, which was, what is the most radical change that AI will bring to the way local news is produced, distributed, and ultimately shared online? So Natalie Gross from Google, who's a product manager, talked about personalization afforded by the data inherent in AI systems. Connie Moon Sahat, and if you want to see the link, there's more detail here, talked about kind of the positive use cases for AI and local news, but also potential unintended consequences, which I think we all want to avoid. The idea that AI could be more diverse, help contextualize local news and make it more accessible, but at the same time, it might be more centralized. And what she means by that is fleshed out in the blog. Folks from Medan talked about the potential for AI to help with media literacy in real time. And as if you were watching Barack Obama's big marquee speech last week around the impact of bolstering local newsrooms for sustaining democracy and the connection with AI, Samu Vincent talked about the pro-democratic function of local news being bolstered through the use of AI. So clearly there are vast societal implications on this intersection of AI and local news, as you've probably all been thinking about. And I'll offer a few suggestions and assessments of the local news landscape in particular, but hopefully these will be applicable to folks who work in larger newsrooms as well. So PAI embarked on our work in AI and local news a little over a year ago as part of a cohort of institutions working with the Knight Foundation on what we describe as local news sustainability. And of course, there's this business imperative of how do we improve the dollars and cents and efficiency. And I think Uli was talking about, we serve a public interest, what makes things more efficient through AI. But also at the same time, how do we make sure this notion of sustainability also incorporates ethics? So we don't want to have a wonderful content targeting option for a newsroom that predicts what a user might click, possibly, even if it boosts the bottom line, if it maybe disproportionately targets certain groups in an unsavory way. So kind of these ethical challenges that may trade off against business sustainability are particularly pertinent to local newsrooms who are using these technologies possibly to stay afloat. And the way in which we conduct at PAI are principles, and I'd say that we're creating a scaffolding for principles, right? More than particular principles, because we recognize that each newsroom has discrete goals and needs and uses and characteristics. But here are a few ways in which we're developing this scaffolding. One is to cultivate this interdisciplinary community, as journalism AI has done a wonderful job around the world. We want to kind of continue to bolster that kind of bridging of technologists and journalists and even affected stakeholders or users or readers in thinking about how they're implicated by AI in the newsroom. We want to identify these tensions, these really tricky ethical questions that might trade off against business sustainability, and then produce the scaffolding as I've described. And when we embarked on this project, we recognized that there's a need for ethics and standards in AI news production. And again, we're focused discreetly on local news. And before we wanted to make any claims about how local newsrooms should go about using AI, we wanted to understand how they're using it. And inspired by the Journalism AI report and also a recent report by our colleagues focused on the US of the Associated Press looking at local newsrooms and their needs and readiness around AI, they found that actually local newsrooms are not really using AI to date. And I think what we want to frame for you all and also for these institutions is that just because they're not using AI today does not mean we should be creating this scaffolding and guidelines this moment. We want to do this, I describe it as before the train has left the station. This is the time to think about AI ethics, not when, if you're like a large technology company, you're in the press being bashed for violating ethical boundaries, and then you retroactively create guidelines. Not that the press, dictates what we should be doing responsibly, but the idea that we should think about these things in advance. But while AI has not been widely adopted in local newsrooms, something that we're keen to do is to extend our understanding of AI and the news and AI ethics and the news to really deeply incorporate social media and news aggregators. If you're thinking about business sustainability, it's hard to not think about the implications and reliance upon platforms that are sharing and targeting and spreading content. So if there's an opportunity to affect their ethical framework as well for an institution like us that has connectivity to technologists and platforms, we hope to change their sense of AI ethics and its effect on news and borrow from the journalistic practices that they should be inspired from. So again, we want to extend our understanding of AI and local news to include not just the newsroom itself, but this broader ecosystem of algorithmic processes that are implicating the impact of AI systems and their connection to news. So that leads me to an initial suite of recommendations. Again, we're in the process. I have my contact info, so if you'd like to get involved in our work in creating these, we'd love for that. But a few high-level pieces and points that are very much built on the work of others here and also our partner community's feedback. Number one is that before you do anything, articulate clear goals for adopting AI. Uli modeled this beautiful, and I know that at the top of the ethics principles on BR's website, it says that they ask themselves one question every time they're about to embark on employing a new technology. And that is, does this really offer a tangible benefit to our users and employees? And I love that duality of both employees and users and readers and people who will be incorporating this content. A second is really diving into transparency and accountability mechanisms that accompany the implementation of AI tools. And these get thrown around a lot, I'd argue, in the machine learning space as important buzzwords, but buzzwords nonetheless. And my colleagues who run the fairness, transparency, and accountability work at PAI have offered us kind of this very rainbow and colorful depiction of different values related to AI ethics goals that range from accountability to privacy, security, safety, and some of these may trade off against one another, which I think is super important to think about. And we surveyed the PAI community to basically ask them which of these AI ethics values are most important to the implementation of AI tools in newsrooms. And we got accountability, explainability, and fairness back, which again are high-level principles. And I'd suggest borrowing from other domains in the machine learning space or broader documentation efforts in machine learning. My colleagues run an effort called About ML, which is opportunities for implementing transparency at scale. And it is our hope that we can adapt these first principles for AI ethics to different domains like journalism and others and make them bespoke to the use cases that you all think about. But this is a good starting place for actually operationalizing transparency. Here, there's this idea that your technology implementation should borrow from the standards and values of your news operation. Journalists, as you all know, are starting not from scratch with thinking about ethics, and there should be a dialogue between kind of how technology is being deployed and also the values and journalistic standards you use. Newsroom staff need to actively supervise AI tools. I know this point of human involvement and human in the loop in technology systems has come up before, but we want to underscore it. And I think something that gets often thrown around, or we heard in our workshops, is that it should be a data scientist or engineer who kind of is this human in the loop as it relates to a technology. But much of our partner community also suggested that an editor should perhaps be involved in overseeing, a recommender system and what it's optimizing for. So just because someone might not have the ostensible technical literacy to tweak a recommender system doesn't mean that they can't affect the values that that system is ultimately promoting and promulgating through your work. Ultimately, explainability is super important. And again, I love this idea of thinking about explainability, not only for the stakeholders who might be programming a system, but also for end users. I know the New York Times runs a blog that regularly posts about technical tools developed in-house. Others have posted to public GitHub repositories, which are venues for sharing their code. And while local newsrooms might be bandwidth constrained to run a blog about all of their AI adoption once they have it, the spirit of actually adding even labels about how content may have been generated using AI for an end user, or understanding what explainability and to whom is useful is a very important step in the newsroom AI process. And lastly, while you are not necessarily thinking of yourself as distributors, distribution platforms should embed journalistic values into their systems. So again, while you are grappling with your role in ethical AI as it relates to news, do not forget that there's this whole prong of the field that's operating and distributing your content that should be listening to you about journalistic values and how those might work. And I want to point out the work of the News Quality Initiative, which has done wonderful work bridging and bringing together journalists and technologists to actually articulate what values AI recommender systems should be promoting online, and so that those can better serve the news ecosystem. So in layman's terms, or hopefully maybe this is the summary slide, know your why for AI. Transparency is a big buzzword, but operationalizing that into its more specific parts, accountability, explainability, fairness, and unpacking that is important. Start from journalistic principles. I want to underscore human involvement and consider distribution and unique challenges of how content is being shared and distributed. We'll be embarking on this process over the next several years to hopefully delineate these principles and operationalize them a bit more so that newsrooms can use them. And I want to pose a few next steps or open questions that relate to how we grapple with what it means to do ethical AI in a local newsroom. One is to think about unique challenges for local versus larger newsrooms. The New York Times has very different challenges, but sometimes also overlapping ones with local newsrooms. So what does it mean to prioritize maybe the ethics for a recommender system over an image recognition model? What are the discrete use cases that we should actually differentiate? Or are there just general first principles that we should be driving from? How do we adapt documentation and fairness work and research from other fields? Should we borrow the documentation practices from machine learning in medicine? I'm sure there's a lot we can learn, but there's also domain specificity. This role of distributors keeps me up at night around, to what extent it's great that newsrooms are thinking about their ethical responsibility, but if we don't think about distributor responsibility, I don't think we will be achieving as much as we can. Global considerations, we've largely focused on the US to date, but how do you make an infrastructure for AI ethics that is sound for those on this call from India, from all the other regions? So I see someone in Berlin, from Korea. How do we think about that? And then this idea of participatory mechanisms, interdisciplinary mechanisms for building these guidelines. How do we sustain those? How do we involve readers, listeners, users in this practice to inform our recommendations and also underscore the unique needs of institutions themselves? So I'll stop there because there's now a adorable, cute baby on my screen. And I want to thank you all, and I'm looking forward to a lively conversation. I'll stop presenting.
Great, thank you so much, Claire, and thank you, Uli, again for your presentations. I believe you should all have the option now to unmute yourselves, but please do use the raise hand functionality if you have questions for either of them. Okay, so we can start with you, Lucila.
Thank you, Uli and Claire, for your presentations. They were really useful. Uli, you mentioned the importance of explaining to journalists and to the newsrooms in general the importance of metadata. We are actually in the project I work at here in Argentina in the process of presenting the project to the newsroom, and we want them to be, of course, involved in the project and to participate in the new workflow we are creating for the production of photos and video. And Claire, you also made a point about actively involving the staff of the newsrooms into the supervision of processes that are now in the process of being automated. So my question is, Uli, if you could tell us a bit more about how that process of explaining and transmitting the importance of metadata to journalists and the newsrooms was in your case, in your organization. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Lucila, and also interesting use case you're pursuing. Well, again, I think real use cases are really helpful to explain to journalists what is in for them. So we had a few weeks ago a presentation of our prototype. I showed you in my slides the prototype of Remix Regional, it's called. It's a regional news briefing, and it grabs audio news, segments the audios, and then you can get a personalized version of that. And for our journalists, it means a little more work, I would say, and also I would say some workflow improvements, because as soon as we do a hybrid workflow, we have to check on how do they use their metadata. Is there a standardized process? Usually not. And usually in the beginning, they have to tag more. And as soon as an algorithm picks up, they will have less work. But in the beginning, they will have conceptual work, and then they will have just more manual work to tag content. And of course, that sucks, because our newsroom is really, really busy, like every newsroom in the whole world, I would say. And coming with a real example, and we already had a prototype on it running that shows them what's in for them. Like, we use your content and you can use it a second time. You don't have to produce more content or different content. You can use the same quality content you already have, and then we can reach more users with that, with a very fancy and digital product. So making their content shine more in a new way is a very, very good argument for them, for us to persuade them to care more about the metadata. And also making metadata less theoretical and more practical, making them understand how we use that metadata and how that really leads to a new product. This whole product workflow really also helps to, well, create a better data awareness, I would say. As soon as we try to explain that in a theoretical way, everyone says, oh yeah, of course, metadata is very important, but you can already see them thinking about something else. Using a concrete product would be my advice.
Thank you so much.
Great. Ruth, Rahul, and then Verena.
I try to come in. Okay, my name is Ruth. Hi. Thank you, Uli, and thank you, Claire, for those insights. I'm from Deutsche Welle, and we worked nearly 1 year in an interdisciplinary group in 2020 to get the guidelines done. So we did it in the end, and it was a really, really hard process. And we have a lot of guidelines, but they are very comparable to what you said, right? It sounds maybe a bit different, but it's comparable. And we did something like, we divided it in 2 streams. One saying we've got a strategic view on it, and we have strategic guidelines to say and they are very important for the management, and they have to be updated maybe even quicker than the ethical guidelines. The second stream, it's the ethical guidelines. So what I would like really to know is, what are your ideas, or Uli, what are your experiences, is how can we bring it in the company itself? So we work very hard on it. So that has something to do with information, of course. So we build artificial, or now we say AI team in Deutsche Welle, 3 persons, and they have a lot of jobs to do. The information, one of the biggest things. But on top, we work on a questionnaire, because in the guidelines we said people have to work along those. We don't do it at the moment completely. I'm very honest on this, but we try hard and we make it very transparent. So what are your ideas and what are your experiences?
Maybe I'll start with an analogy and then Uli can give her first-person account of the newsroom. So it's funny because you would think that large technology companies don't have the same challenge of getting institutional buy-in for these principles and good people trying really hard. But it's the same problem at a lot of the large technology companies that ostensibly have this all figured out. So just a few high-level ideas that we've seen. Executive sponsorship of guidelines is super important. That's signaling at an institution. So and especially at a newsroom where I think editorial executive sponsorship is what changes behavior, or what we've seen at some of our partners. That's important. Linking it to performance review infrastructure has proven useful, or making sure that, you know, how people are living these guidelines or values has been part of it. And also I think on the notion of trying, something that we've instilled is that it's okay to get it wrong. I know this sounds really soft and like organizational behavior advice, but we've noticed that if you put out kind of a call to review these principles once a year, let's say, to imply that they're not as static as, you know, this is the right answer and this is the wrong one, people are more receptive to opting into something when it feels like there's room for growth or it's an evolving document. So these are softer skills that we've borrowed from other industries, just where the rubber really hits the road. But I actually would commend you on linking the strategic component to the ethical component, because in partners that we've seen, those who have kind of a governance structure for review, and I know it's hard with 3 people working on the AI team, but these guidelines should not just be produced. I think Uli was saying use cases are the most useful thing. Microsoft, which is obviously a huge powerhouse institution that you don't want to borrow everything from, but they have a committee that kind of serves as the Supreme Court, looking at use cases as they apply to their guidelines. And I think this spirit of evolution, and also tying to, like, that doesn't get you out of, you know, out of jail free to not think about these things because they're evolving is super important. But Uli probably has tips for day-to-day what to do beyond high-level organizational behavior recommendations.
Thank you.
These were excellent tips, Claire. I will take some of them. And the idea of a Supreme Court is really interesting, because now we have an opt-in. Of course, this is not something you really have to, we don't control that. And I think it's a good thing not to control that right now, because people should want to opt in. We have to make people enthusiastic about it, and controlling it would be some kind of, well, would be adversarial, I think. And also, Ruth, congrats to your own guidelines. I've read them and I can recommend them for everyone because they are really, really great, and we learned a ton from them.
Thank you.
And to your question, what I can add to Claire is we are drafting workshops right now, because we have an internal department that is responsible for internal learning. And what we are doing with them, they are drafting workshops where people can get into a time capsule, and they are landing in the year of 2035. And then we are visiting a museum, and this museum shows all the use cases we are having now. And in those use cases, we have to make clear what we should change now to get to the place in 2035. So that makes people understand what we really have to do now to get change done. And we are trying to implement the ethical guidelines. What are the pitfalls? Where might something occur that is against our values that are already in place? So tying practical work and the situation of employees to AI is something I think might be very useful, because AI is something the usual newsroom employee or journalist is not really in touch with. So this might be interesting, but it doesn't really have to do anything with their work. But tying that to their work, plus well, presenting what kind of values are important might be helpful.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Rahul and then Vedana.
Thank you, Lakshmi. I need to make a quick observation and then I'll come to the question. Throughout human history, we have realized that ethics has been a major point of debate throughout civilizations. And if you go in detail, The
Oops, I think he got cut out. So we'll go to Verena and then Patricia. And if Rahul joins back, we'll continue on with his question.
Okay, hi. My name is Verena. I'm from the Austria Press Agency. And we just finished our guidelines 2 weeks ago. And I think it's what's now in place is it was a similar process, I think, like we heard in an interdisciplinary team. And for us, it's also a question because we are also a technology provider too. I'm not only journalistic, but and there are the biggest questions when it comes to being the technology, as providing technology to others. In this issue, because this is much more difficult than using it for our own. And this is things we have to think a lot about in the future, how we come there. I have one question. Uli, I read on your website that you differ when it comes to R&D from the process when implementing a product. And I'm curious because when should we do where should we be strict? Because we have a lot of things in our R&D department. If you have a close look to it, this is not ethical. Because they are trying out what they can do. So how do you handle this? Because it's you much more. You take the ethical principles to your R&D. Is it a good idea to do so, or should we capsule them a little bit and say, okay, let's find out what for us what you can find out, and then we have a look and we make it according to standards like GDPR and something like that. For us, the guidelines came out of a project on responsible AI in face detection in our image databases. And we thought face detections, now it's the point where we should have these ethical discussions because out there is a lot of rumor around these topics. Yeah, what will be the best thing? Where should we be there when it comes to R&D and to the product team?
Thank you for the question, Verena, but it's a hard one because I'm not really for restricting innovation. Of course, our policy very clearly is that we only invest resources in products that might be published, and that's why we have this interdisciplinary reflection from the beginning on. So we make sure that in the end there is a product that is really along our values and along our lines. This doesn't necessarily mean that we restrict ourselves, I have to say, and I haven't thought about that in the way you were just presenting it. But what came to my mind is when we are working on something that is not being used for a product, that might be interesting for investigation, right? Because you mentioned face detection. This is something that might be a good starting point for investigative reporters to dig in. So finding something in R&D that is not right for a product because it's not along your values might be interesting for the investigation. As we are combining investigation and product, this is very easy for us. But as you also work in an interdisciplinary environment, that might be the solution for that.
Thanks.
Okay, now we can move on to Rahul, who's back with us, and Patricia. But I just want to let everybody know that we are running close to time. So if you do want to leave, please feel free to do so. But we will get to these questions first. Thank you.
Okay, so the point which I was trying to make is that whenever we have debated ethics and in the context of journalism and in context of civilizations, in context of societies, we have realized that there is always this big question that who is going to take the decision that this is ethical and this is not. And when we practice journalism, and specifically with the legacy media, there are structures in place, there are guidelines. But what about journalists who are alone? And especially in the COVID times, we see many people who have branched out. They're running their own websites, they're running their own YouTube channels. Who takes a call in that? Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that we are all humans, and we are there are follies and there are challenges. So, unfortunately, the system does not provide for creating awareness per se. The schools don't teach ethics vis-a-vis journalism. They teach you to be accurate, they teach you to be fast, and they teach you to all the 5 Ws, 1H, and whatnot. But ethics primarily is not taught. Now, my question here is to Claire and Uli both, that in a scenario where we are going to have artificial intelligence into the cesspool, if I might put it that way, where do you think it is going to be headed now?
I guess that's a question for you, Claire. Do you want to start?
Sure. So at a high level, you're very right that AI ethics have been there's a debate around what is ethical. I don't think anyone has a perfect answer or can give a prescriptive depiction of what the ethical thing to do is around facial recognition, around what to optimize for. If it's, the example I love to use around personalized paywalls, like that is up for debate. I think what you brought up is super interesting is who gets to arbitrate that decision ultimately, right? About are you modeling that kind of debate out loud? So I think what the guidelines afford is some degree of, here is the logic or framing we are using to debate these issues. It's not saying that we will ban necessarily facial recognition, though you could go as far as that. You're saying here are the values and here is the kind of nudge in the direction to grapple with these things. And I'm not saying that absolves us of responsibility to actually make decisions, but it's a starting place to do what you're describing and actually say how hard this is. A second point that you brought up, which I was hearing, which I'm going to complicate even more, is this idea of like, what is the lever of impact? Is it doing something at the institutional level? Is it having, BR actually have this introspection? What about all this content that gets generated? Let's say Claire Leibowitz has a personal blog. Is she going to create her own suite of guidelines? I will say that we're creating a set of guidelines or a code of conduct around synthetic media that targets creators as a category. And we grappled with this because, an institution might be able to publish a policy or a suite of guidelines, but what about all these individual creators who just do their own thing on the web? And we're not, prescribing this, but we said, if you have a website, if you have a Twitter, maybe there could be a norm that along with the blue check mark or along with that thing, you say what suite of principles you kind of adhere to. You wear that value on your sleeve, and it's not a perfect answer, but I think there is norm setting that we can do to make sure it's not just large institutions who control some of the flow of information, but there are many people, as you say, who are working independently. But maybe there could be a norm that on your Instagram profile or your Twitter, there's still an articulation of a few values you ascribe to. So validating your point that ethics are debated, that doesn't mean that there's not useful. I mean, we have courts of law where things are debated, and I think that instilling some precedent where you articulate those debates and model them will help us all get closer to the right outcome that you're describing. Though the cesspool idea, we could debate another time on whether or not it truly is a cesspool or will afford lots of opportunity with all these smart people working on these topics. I hope that helps both validate and expand upon what you said, but it's a great, great point.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. We have time just for the last 2 questions. Patricia and Piyush, we have about 4 minutes. Maybe if you both could articulate your questions and then they can take the questions together.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Uli and Claire. Hi, nice to see you here. I used to see you around Twitter and Telegram. I've been working for the last year in an ethical guidelines for the ethical use of AI in journalism, and our National Media Council just published it. You both, Claire, Uli, you have been an inspiration. We have been following all what you have been doing also from other industries. But finally, we decided we based our work in confronting AI, the uses of AI with the traditional journalistic values, first of all, truth, justice, etc. And then we incorporated cyber ethic values, explainability, etc. No? We focused precisely in AI ethics in production, in journalistic production. And I found very interesting this point that Claire mentioned about AI ethics in distribution. And my question is precisely, how can you control ethics in distribution? In what aspects can we focus?
So that's a great point, and thank you for prompting me to expand upon it, because I recognize that talking to a lot of journalists, they might feel helpless, and there are these big distributors who are doing unsavory things. What role do we have to play? One area that is interesting that we've been thinking about is the fact that the underlying technology for, let's say, recommending content is similar, actually, that you might be using that is being used at Facebook, for example, to distribute content. So I think one interesting way for newsrooms to have voice around these topics is to really be explicit about better ways to distribute content as a newsroom that might then apply to larger institutions. So that's not to put the burden on a newsroom by any means, but I think there is this recognition that when we are targeting folks or distributing content, what is the ethical way to do that? And that is a challenge that both implicates, I think, a newsroom that has a website and also a social media platform, though to different degrees. Another element, and I mentioned the News Quality Initiative's work, is this idea, and I think we were also hearing from, I think it was actually in the previous comment around, how do we ensure that journalistic voice is given to the decisions being made at platforms? And there's been a lot of interesting creative mechanisms for experimenting with that. One of my colleagues has proposed an idea of platform democracy, where actual users, readers, people around the world would weigh in at platforms and make decisions about what content should be recommended or what's ethical. So that's an interesting governance model where there might be more people involved. So I think there's both this idea of, one, how do people at the forefront of AI and news in the newsroom who are focused on production still think about questions around recommendation, distribution, and those ethical challenges, and say how those might be applicable to the news aggregators and platforms that share content in the same way technically. And also us and other institutions experimenting with models for participatory decision-making for distribution. So if we're not going to optimize for engagement, what values do we care about? Is it truth, accuracy, as you described for journalism, or is it user well-being or all these other topics? And how do we as a community kind of make those decisions? We're kind of experimenting with models for how we engage those different voices around decision-making platforms. So the technology itself, and then also experimental venues and models for bridging actual stakeholders that might inform distribution ethics.
Thanks, Claire.
Okay, we're at time, but if it's okay with you, Uli and Claire, do you want to take one more question?
Sure.
Sure.
Okay, so Piyush, you can go next, and then we wrap.
Yeah, hi, am I audible?
Yes,
Yeah,
you are.
okay. This is Piyush, I'm from India. First of all, thanks for the wonderful session. It's been very insightful. My query is, like, we talk a lot about artificial intelligence, machine learning, data science, and I've seen a lot of prototypes being used in the newsrooms like BBC, New York Times, Guardian, Washington Post, and other international newsrooms. But I'm looking for certain examples from which are not prototypes, but actually are being used as a product. For instance, I've seen like automated insights from APs doing a wonderful job. So can you, can you share some examples which are being used in the newsrooms, not in the form of prototypes, but in the form of actual products?
Sure. I guess there are a lot of tools that are done by startups right now. The whole tooling part is done by startups, for example, transcription, or also audio tagging, content tagging. That is good for archiving and also for re-automating content, making your search better. There are some tools out there that you can buy kind of off the shelf, but you have to implement them to your workflows and to your systems. And also I talked about our products as prototypes because we rework them and reiterate them, but everything we do is put in front of journalists or put in front of users. So we publish what we do and we try to get better in doing so. So also those prototypes are put in front of users. If you want concrete examples, just reach out and we can talk. Depends really on what you want to do because the environment and the field is so big.
Great. Thank you so much, Uli, and thank you so much, Claire. Thank you all for joining us and for your engagement. You had such great questions today. This is just one of many workshops that we're going to be conducting over the next few months. Sabrina is just going to give you a teaser of what you can expect in the next workshop. Make sure to sign up to our newsletter to get more details about it too.
Yes, hi, hello everyone. Thank you for joining this workshop. I'm just quickly going to tell you that the next community workshop will focus on how to use AI to cover elections. So if you want to sign up to our newsletter and our Telegram channels, we will keep you updated on how to sign up and join for the next workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina. Thank you, Uli. Thank you, Claire. And thank you all for joining us. See you all next time.